And we're live. Welcome back, everyone, to another high vibe conversation. I'm your host, 𝗦cy𝗽𝗵𝗶. With me today are Jenny Langren, Dorit Carlson, Linda Vetrus-Nichols, Stina Marie, and special guest, Sophie Jacobs. Today, we're going to be talking all about spiritual courage, and we are so excited to have Sophie with us here today. Sophie, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about who you are?
Thanks, Shell, for that introduction. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation. I can just feel in my heart that this is one that is like a collective need. But before we even get into the conversation, I'll tell a little bit about myself. I spent over 2 years writing this book called The Intuition Experiment. And it's really taken a big part of my life. It's essentially this experiment that I undertook to focus in on what is like this inner knowing principle, like what is intuition. And I took it one journal entry one day at a time. And so the culmination of those experiences over more than a year, I would say, is what the book is about. And so it just got published this January. And yeah, I mean, I could say more, but I think that's really what's relevant. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you. And we're so honored that you could be here with us today. Why don't we just jump right into it then? How does intuition relate to spiritual courage? Are they one and the same, or how do you differentiate those?
That is a really good question. I think intuition is a facet of spiritual courage. I think it takes courage not only to listen to it, but I think it especially takes courage to act on it. I feel like with intuition, there are kind of two polarizing energies, or almost like a yin and yang, feminine, masculine, receptive and active energy that goes along with it. Like first you kind of receive the knowing, and then the courage, in my view, is actually to take a step in the direction of what you've received. And that step, even if there's a part of you that still holds fear, or holds like the stories or like the conditionings that are either going against or different from maybe some sort of intuitive guidance you've gotten, that is courageous, because I think intuition doesn't necessarily speak in logic, doesn't necessarily speak in the thinking mind either. So it takes courage to actually listen to the language of how it speaks. Sometimes it speaks in the body, a sensation tone. Sometimes it speaks in like auditory processing. Maybe we're hearing a song in our head and the lyrics have some sort of message. Like there's different sense channels and sense doors that we have access to. And that listening, that being willing to receive and being open in and of itself is a kind of courage, because a lot of our protective system in our psyche is trying to kind of shut us out from what we may know to be true. We've got a lot of like protectors typically in the system. So that protection often blocks us from information from like naturally flowing through. So I would say it takes both a courage to open up and receive, but it also takes a courage to just take the first step in the direction from what we might perceive to be our intuition. And then I would even say lastly, it takes courage to recognize that maybe it wasn't your intuition, to like still remain in that not knowing space of, well, I'm not quite sure, but let me just experiment. And so that's why it became really important for me to call my book The Intuition Experiment, because I don't claim that like I know 100% of what is going on or what I'm doing. And I even think that really embracing the not knowingness of life actually opens us up more to connection. And so there's a unique kind of courage in taking a step in a direction we think or we've intuited is the right step, and then really being honest with ourselves of like, where did this take us? And is this actually where I want to go? So
Yeah, would you mind if we talk about that a little bit more?
yeah.
I know as you were writing this book, it kind of all kicked off with one of your experiences, right? You were talking about like um your house burned down, and like what was that experience like for you, and how did you lean into that with your intuition?
hmm Yeah, so this was back in August of 2020. For a little bit of context, I was working out of my family's home during COVID. I had just graduated from college, and I was essentially in a startup position where I was working from home, but that was kind of like my life was consumed by that. Um, there were a lot of fire scares over the summer, but that particular day, there were dry lightning strikes that had kind of touched down on neighboring counties nearby, and it didn't seem to be like a, a very close threat, but it was something that I was keeping my eye on. And during that time, actually, my mom and my stepdad were out of town. They were helping my sister renovate her apartment. So I was home alone. And there were a couple of things that kind of came up for me that day that felt kind of particularly, I don't know if the word discordant, or like there's just some sort of offness that I could kind of sense within my being. Um, One of those moments was actually when I took a walk with my two dogs, and when I came back, there was a dead bird that appeared on the doorstep. Now, that had never happened to me, or I'd like never seen a dead bird appear on the doorstep before like that. And I just remember looking at it and just having some sort of visceral reaction to its presence, and like actually having this urge to bury it. And like, yeah, it's like this like flooding of just like care and compassion for this bird, but also like some sense of like hauntedness. And so I was sitting with just like the sensations and feelings of that, and I ended up burying the bird. But I distinctly remember it was a visceral moment when I walked back from the burial to the house. I was walking really slowly, and I started to like let out this like really weird moan, or like the grumble, or like a and I think I was connected to something else in that moment. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something there in the air. Um, and so I was kind of, I was on edge all day in the sense of like something was off. And then I remember at night, I was about to go to bed. I was actually like sitting on my bed, well, really just like laying down on my bed, and I was watching this series, Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I had been watching to um, kind of get away from work a little bit. And it's interesting because the premise of that tale is about this young boy who is the avatar. So his mission is to basically master the four elements to restore order to the earth. Now there's a really big message in it that I feel like is very symbolic of kind of the world we're living in right now, but essentially like in this storyline, the Fire Nation was attacking and was kind of dominating the world that this story was in. And so as I was watching it, I was like literally seeing an episode of the Fire Nation coming and like destroying a village. And that also felt really weird to me. And so I actually like remembered turning off the show, and I texted my stepbrother's girlfriend at the time. They lived half an hour away, and they were like the closest contacts I had. And I remember she was saying something like, you can stay over here if you want, if you don't feel comfortable. Like, we know there are fires kind of around. And so, yeah, I was like, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to take you up on that because something about this doesn't feel right. I'm just going to head over with the dogs. This was about 9:30 at night. And by I think about 12:30 in the morning, the whole house was burned down to the ground. I think What's striking about it too is that my mom had shared with me, oh, you'll be fine. Like your neighbors will let you know if you need to evacuate. And if it's not the neighbors, it'll definitely be kind of like the fire crew. Well, if I had listened to authority and listened to kind of the dominant narrative of like what I should have done, I would have probably died. I'm a very what is the word? Heavy sleeper. I probably wouldn't have answered a phone call in the middle of the night. But even further than that, the neighbors on my street actually, like, some of them didn't take their phones, didn't take their shoes, like they were running out the door, and some of them even died. So it was really a situation in which if I hadn't have trusted kind of the gut feelings, the language of my body and how it was speaking to me, I quite literally would have passed away. And so in that sense, it really brought this urgency to laser in on what is this? What is this kind of um, life intelligence going on that had protected me and had given me basically another chance at life? You know, it was quite a profound moment, I think, for me, and kind of rupturing the sense that there's something more here, and there's something more I'd like to kind of explore.
It's rare that I don't have any words to share. So this is humbling for me. But thank you, because there is more to share here. There is a deeper conversation, and I applaud you for your courage to trust your intuition, for leaning into something felt off. This doesn't feel right. Like, I need to protect myself. And in every instance of those moments that you had throughout the day, on that particular day, and I'm sure you've experienced it in other ways throughout this intuition experiment, but on this particular day, like, you had several hits of something's off.
Mm-hmm.
And you were open enough with yourself to trust it and lean into that and to not fight it. So I think that is very courageous, to trust yourself that, okay, let me take this in, and whatever happens, at least, like, I am more prepared for it. And you had no idea, to your point earlier, of what was coming, but you trusted yourself. And this reminds me, Dorit, I'm coming to you. So this reminds me of what Dorit often says of I know and I trust, and leaning into what she knows to be true about herself. So I want to thank you for leaning into that and sharing with us that you knew something was off and you trusted yourself to uncover it, and get yourself to safety. Dorit, I'm coming over to you now. Since we're talking about I know and I trust and leaning into courage, how do you experience spiritual courage? And do you often get hits that are intuitive in the same way, or do you experience spiritual courage in a different way?
Thank you, Shell. Well, I use my intuition as a job. I work with it, so I have to be very attuned to it, listen to it, and kind of trust it, because it is what guides me. When I have clients, I don't have a manuscript. I don't have a set of questions that I ask my clients, and I don't give advice to my clients, because I guide them by asking the questions, and that just comes up. I'm kind of just connecting with my eyes closed and trusting what comes up in my intuition, and the answers that they find within themselves is what gives them direction. Because in this time we live in, there are so many disturbances, so much static noise, to block out the information that we do have inside. And that's what I use, the I know and I trust. I try to collect what I have inside me, in my heart, in my subconscious, call it whatever you like, and don't let the surroundings disturb me, and don't try not to get nervous when I'm speaking, and try not to get too influenced by other people's opinions. Take it into account, of course, but trust what comes up in me. And when I started my journey to get educated as a leadership by heart coach and a hypnotherapist, I will have to say I used my spiritual courage, because I was so lost at that point. I didn't know where to go, but I got this urge that I really want to help people. I really need to do something, because I'd been helpless for 7 years. And I really wanted to make a difference, to help people feel better. And I had no clue how to do that. I knew I couldn't go out and have a job because I was ill. So I just knew that I had to do it from home, but I didn't know how. So I was just listening to my body, and something came up like a neon sign in my mind. And that was something that I've heard friends say when I've talked to them, just random coffee meetings or whatever. They used to say that I always feel so much better when I've talked to you. And I'm like, oh, there it was, like blinking in neon. They feel better when they've talked to me. Can I do something about that? How can I use that? And the very next day I was browsing Facebook, didn't have a job, so what else could I do? And there was this ad for this Norwegian Leadership by Heart Academy, that they were opening up a new program, and I reached out to them, and well, 5 years later, so it's just trusting what comes up, and not ignoring. Like Sophie said, you can't ignore those kind of things that comes up. They mean something. You have to listen when your body and your mind gives you those signs, or divine intervention, whatever you like to call it, but don't ignore it. Can I share a little story that I heard? And that story is kind of what I keep in the back of my mind, and whenever I'm in doubt, I'm like, oh, this might be it. It goes something like, there was a very, very religious old lady that was caught in a flood. She was able to get up on the roof, and she was praying to God to come and save her. Have you heard it before? Yeah. She was praying and calling to God, please save me, please save me. I can't get off this roof. And all of a sudden there came a boat with rescuers. And they say, come on, ma'am, we'll help you. Come here. No, God's going to save me. God's going to save me. And they were like, yeah, but come into the boat. We'll take you into shore. And she was like, no, God's going to save me. And she just pushed them away and didn't want to follow them into the boat. They left. And after a while, another rescue team came with a helicopter, trying to save her, pulling her up. And she was like, no, the Lord will save me. The Lord will save me. And the same thing over again. She sent them away. And well, it ended up the house was swept away by the water, and the old lady died. And when she met up with the Lord above, and he said, why didn't you answer? I sent people to save you. And she was like, well, I thought you would come in person, like reach down from the sky and just grab me and put me onto the shore. She didn't realize that the Lord was kind of providing her with this salvation, the rescue that she needed. So that's what I'm thinking. Is this my salvation? Is this my rescue that is here now? Or am I waiting for something bigger, something else? So yeah, listen to listen to your intuition and trust what you get served.
Jenny, I saw you on mute. What do you got?
I was just thinking that this woman was attached to the ideal of how she thought that would work out. And recently I was just working with a client who came to me with such fear of how she would be perceived and such fear of, accepting herself as she was and as things were. And it was such a beautiful process of following her as she let go of those fears and let go of those ideals, let go of the things that she could not control, to start listening, to begin cultivating that compassionate spirit with herself, to trust what was coming from inside of her. And I think that's for us to be so vulnerable. She was so courageous to open up and share. For us to be so vulnerable, it takes a compassionate spirit towards ourselves, for us to open that door towards ourselves with, curiosity and understanding and listening and compassion, to not judge ourselves based on the ideals that we might have been brought up with. And it's just so powerful to see what comes along when a person starts stepping into their power and their intuition. And I'm curious to know, Sophie, what comes up for you when I talk about the compassionate relationship towards self, when it comes to knowing ourselves and cultivating that courageous spirit. And thank you, Dorit. I really enjoyed that story. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Jenny. I've been actually sitting with this as you were speaking with it. And it seems to me that they're almost one and the same. It's like that same compassionate spirit is the same one that moves us to give us the message. And so I often feel that we can be courageous when we feel like we're held by something bigger. That bigness could be like the isness, that's the experience. It could be like however you want to kind of relate to it, God, source, creation. When we feel held by something bigger, and it could just be like bringing in compassion, it's that same element that actually allows us to get into the flow of life. And that flow of life is where intuition just naturally comes through. It's almost like a byproduct. It's not something to achieve. It's just like entering a state in which you can receive. It's like setting the conditions up to receive it. So like, yeah, I feel that it's important to distinguish that it's not about like something to grab onto and like claim as our own, but actually like a state of compassionate presence that then allows for this field of receptivity to life to then move us. And yeah, and I think there's something else in the equation here, or this conversation that I feel like is important to bring up, which is, if someone has really ignored, discounted, or protected themselves from their knowing for a long time, it can be really hard to just say, oh, well, just quit your job, or it's hard to. I think a lot of people, think of intuition and they're like, oh, does this mean I have to like break up, or does this mean I have to do some like drastic like life change? And my view is no. It's actually like intuition is just found in this present moment. So what is here right now, and what wants to come forth, or what doesn't want to come forth? Like what is here? So I really connect it to just present moment, heart-centered living. And so it doesn't have to look like completely changing your life from the inside out to quote unquote follow your intuition. It's really a moment to moment investigation and opening up to what's here right now.
I love that. Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, that whole idea of judgment Jenny brought up. And following your intuition is so much about staying out of judgment. And I love the story of the sage. The sages, the warriors were coming and taking the boys, the adolescent boys, out of the village. And at that time, just before that happened, the sage's son broke his leg, and everyone was like, "Oh, it's so terrible that your son broke his leg," and blah blah blah. And the sage's reply was, "Maybe." Right? And like, they didn't know that the soldiers were coming, and the soldiers came and they took all the boys except for the sage's son because he had broken his leg. And it's like, "Oh, it's so great that they didn't take your son because of his broken leg." And the sage said, "Maybe." Right? So staying out of judgment gives you that freedom. You don't have all these little voices of, like Sophie mentioned earlier, authority, or whatever. It's just is. And I love how you mentioned like living from your heart, because that's part of your human, right? So make decisions with your heart. Use your soul for counsel and your brain for storage, as Terry Earthwind Nichols always says, right? So I just love that. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, ladies, for sharing. Stina, I'm coming over to you now. What comes up for you when we talk about intuition and spiritual courage?
Thanks, Jill. And thanks, like Sophie, Dora, Linda, everybody, and Jenny, like everybody's sharing so many things that it's like weaving together so beautifully. I just love it. I was thinking about how, for me, growing my intuition, or like understanding and trusting my intuition, oftentimes I was trying to think of a story, and I was like, Sophie's already given us her like house fire story. And for me, it's the moments where you leave the house at 9:30 and then nothing happens. Right? So like if nothing happened that night, what would the story be after that? Right? Because for me, it's getting to that moment after where nothing happened and being like, I'm so glad that I just honored myself. I'm so glad that I heard that, I felt it, and I did it. Because what difference did it make, in the end? Maybe then nothing, right? Like nothing. I think it would belong in quotes. But what remains is that you listened and you took action. And that is, for me, what has grown my body's trust in myself. So like my body knows that if it tells me it's hungry, I will feed it. My body knows that if it tells me it's unsafe, I will speak up. I will take action to get myself out of a situation. Those are all things that get really messed up when your nervous system is a mess, when you've grown up in a house where it's not safe for you to speak, or you do speak up, you do express some of your intuition, or something doesn't feel right, and it's kind of poo-pooed, it's kind of like, like that's not a big deal. And we learn to do that to ourselves. We put off our needs, and we don't pay attention to those moments where you're like, something's not right here. And I think that the moments where we talk a lot about the moments where things do happen, because like it makes a much better story. And it's obviously like super impactful when you're like, oh my gosh, like I avoided this thing. But anytime I miss a turn and I'm like, oh, it's going to take me 2 more minutes to get to my destination, I'm like, avoided an accident. That's what I tell myself literally every time I make a wrong turn or I, miss a highway exit, because that feels better to me than berating myself for not paying attention, missing the exit, not being in the right lane, frustrated I'm going to be late. Because I've been in a car accident, and I would just prefer to think that like there's some part of me that like knew that this was the better route today. And so all of those little things that you can like nourish in yourself, make it so that in those moments when something isn't right and you do get yourself out of the house and there is a catastrophe, like, then you do it, you follow through, you listen, you know what that feels like. You're a little more like just aware of those little inklings. Because usually, like, if you're just completely ignoring all of it, then like those moments don't happen. You're not able to react or respond in a way that's like methodical, right? And gets you out of that situation. So I also this morning was going through some old journal entries, and I had a quote about courage in there. I was examining why I wanted certainty in my life. Why do I seek certainty? And it was because certainty, like, it brings me a sense of calm and control, and then there's no surprises. And, you know, you're like, you have pre-solved problems when there's certainty. There's nothing that's going to like come up. You don't have to manage your emotions. You don't have to take any risks. Like, certainty is so predictable. And I could see that when I looked for certainty, it actually set me into this cycle where I would look for certainty to avoid shame and punishment. That was my loop. There was shame and punishment when things were not certain. And so what I would do to create certainty was like, I was shaming myself instead. So like no one else had the opportunity to do it. And I would just like make sure that I was affirming my own failure. Like, that was the most certain thing that I could do, was I could certainly fail. Like, we could all say, I can certainly fail, right? But can you certainly succeed? Like, who knows, right? It's kind of it's always a gamble. You can't control everything. So when you're controlling and you want the certainty, you tend towards failure. And it's because certainty is this belief that like, this is real, this is going to happen. You know, you want to know. And that's the opposite of being in the flow of your intuition. But what I wrote about courage was that courage and curiosity take more energy, intention, and effort to create and motivate, because they're not about control and knowing, and they're about adventure and heading into the unknown. So it takes a lot more of you to develop habits that go against fear and uncertainty and like this wanting to control things. And I think that goes along with, you know, the logic that Sophie was like, intuition's it's not really like, here's the math equation for it. It's just this sense that you get.
I don't know if you guys saw on the screen, I got really giddy when you started talking about wrong turns a few minutes ago, and I've been giddy ever since, like dancing in my seat. And we've certainly like we've danced around the wrong turns and letting go of ideals and expectations and certainty, right? And leaning into our intuition. We've all talked about that in some regard today. And as you were talking, Stina, about wrong turns, I immediately had this thought of, have you ever gotten lost on purpose? Because you said when you make a wrong turn, I just avoided an accident, right? You reframe that narrative in your mind. So like, because you never know what you avoided, like you made that wrong turn for a reason. And anytime I get lost when I'm driving or walking, I'm like, well, now we get to explore. We get to find a new way to get there. And I've been saying that for years and never connected the dots until literally just now when you were talking about that. And I was like, I get lost on purpose all the time, because then I have the freedom to explore with curiosity. Then time goes out the window. Then I can make more wrong turns, or I can find my way back. It's like the maze, like the cornfield maze that you probably have done in like the fall somewhere, where like especially when it gets really dark, you don't know if you're going in the right direction or not, or if it's a maze of mirrors, and like You don't know what you're going to bump into, but you have to just trust that you'll find the way out. And the other thing that I was thinking about when Dorit and Jenny were sharing was, how many times have we not trusted ourselves to know what's best for us? Because I know from my own experiences that I still do it all the time. I know what I want to do, what I feel like I need to do, what I get to do, and I will still choose an alternative route because somebody's expectations of me or my expectations of what they think will happen get in the way. And I stick to what's already in progress instead of changing up the way that I know in my heart needs to happen. And sometimes it goes right and sometimes it goes awful, but there's so many times that I know of that I don't trust myself. And so now if I can explore myself with more curiosity too, that would open up so many possibilities. And that is pretty darn spiritual, if you ask me. That is so courageous. And if you want to know more about all the ways that Sophie has explored this, you should definitely go read her book, The Intuition Experiment, because the fire was just one example of how she leaned into her spiritual curiosity, and it is definitely a great read. Sophie, I want to thank you for joining us today. But before I wrap up, where can people grab your book? How can they learn more about you? Where should they connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say first, this was such a rich conversation, and I felt like it just kind of like what Stina was saying previously, it weaved in so many different topics, and it almost feels to me that intuition is kind of like this intuitive muscle, and that it's something that we constantly kind of have to keep refreshing because the present moment is constantly changing. But to answer your question, Shell, people can find my book on Amazon. The paperback is coming out later this week or early next week. And then you can also find it on Kobo or Ingram Sparks. And people can certainly follow me on LinkedIn. I also am pretty active on TikTok and Instagram, where my username is Flow Into It Like Intuition. So thank you, everyone, for just such a really enriching conversation.
It's been wonderful having you all here to join us for another high vibe conversation. This week's topic was all about spiritual courage. If you like having these conversations and more and want to have one with us of your own, we invite you to book a call with us using the link that you see on your screen now. And don't forget that you can come back from week to week to join us for more high vibe conversations where you get all of us on the screen at one time, and you never know where this conversation will lead. So until next week, we will say bye for now.